Okay, hello everyone to the 7th session of the Nāgārjuna Karika reading group. And for this session, we are going over chapters 10 and 11, an analysis of fire and fuel, and an analysis of prior and posterior parts, particularly of samsara. So I will start with chapter 10. And I think it'll be good to start off with the first paragraph of the commentary that Sudhir and Katsura laid out. So the last two chapters have shown difficulties with the notion of an appropriator, a notion that the Pukdalavadins rely on to establish their theory that there is a person who appropriates the 5 skandhas, karma, and the like. Now here, the opponent proposes a new analogy to explain how appropriated and what is appropriated, or how appropriated and what is appropriated can be in a relation of mutual dependence and yet be both ultimately real. The analogy is the example of fire and fuel. As Chandrakirti explains the example, fire is dependent on fuel since there is no fire without fuel, but fire is ultimately real since it has the intrinsic nature of heat. So this is Chandrakirti's gloss of the opponent's view. Yet fuel, while also being real in its own right, is composed of the 4 elements and so depends on the the fire element. Well, yeah, so basically, so we're analyzing the relationship between fire and fuel to also undermine the Pudgalavadin view that the appropriator and the appropriated exist in a relationship of mutual dependence. So if you remember in the last paragraph, the last chapters, the opponent tried to claim that the appropriator existed independently of what is being appropriated. So once we've gone through the deconstruction of that view, now let's say the interlocutor, the opponent, is trying to retain this idea of ultimately real appropriators and appropriated things, but this time has abandoned the view that the appropriator is independent and now tries to claim that they're mutually dependent. And so the function of this chapter is to also undermine that view. Does anyone have any general comments about the whole chapter before I start going verse by verse? Okay, I'll just start verse by verse. So verse 1. If the fuel were identical to the fire, or with the fire, then agent and object would be one. If fire were distinct from fuel, then there would be fire without fuel. And I think I'll also read verse 2. Fire would always be a light. It would be without a cause of lighting. A second beginning is pointless. If it were so, it would be devoid of object. Yeah, so according to the commentary, the first part of verse 1 is sort of easy to understand. We can't say that fuel is identical to fire because that would mean that the agent of an action and the object of that action were the same thing. So it would be like saying, for example, that there's no difference between a potter and a pot, between a forester who chops wood and the wood that is chopped. So we know that there's always a meaningful distinction between the agent and the object. So we can't say that fire and fuel are identical to each other. The other view that fire is distinct from fuel also doesn't make sense because according to the verse, then there would be fire without fuel. So yeah, so if fire were something other than fuel, then in a way it would have its own being independent of that fuel. So you would have fire without fuel, and that doesn't make sense because fire requires fuel to burn. So and the commentary also lists 4 other implications for the idea that fire exists apart from fuel. And I'll just read those out. If fire were a separately existing thing, then it would mean that it would be possible for fire to exist apart from fuel. This would mean, one, that fire would continue to exist after the fuel has been exhausted, so it would always stay alight. This would also mean that there can be no such thing as lighting or starting a fire. And this would, 3, make pointless any attempt to start a fire by finding fuel, since that would be trying to begin something that has already begun. Moreover, 4, fire would be devoid of an object, something on which its activity is exercised. So while we can't say that fire and fuel are identical, because that would be like saying that the agent and object are identical, we can't say they're essentially distinct either, because otherwise they would both be what they are without being in a relationship with each other. So we would have fuel without there being fire, and we have all the properties of fire without there being fuel, including such absurd properties like always having fire, etc. Yeah, and I think verse 3 goes over some of that reasoning. Because it is not dependent on another, it is without a cause of lighting. It being permanently alight, it would follow that restarting is pointless. So I think the argument shifts a little bit now in verse 4. If you were then to say that fuel is that which is being burned, then by what distinct entity is that fuel to be burned when it is fuel only as long as it's being burned? So here the opponent, the supposed opponent, is defining fuel as that which is being burned. But what I got from this is that this actually means that fuel is dependent on fire, and not independent of fire, which is what the opponent is trying to claim. Can you guys, does anyone help me unpack the 4th verse there?
Sorry, it seems that Sagar wrote a message that he wants to get into the Zoom.
Oh yeah, I see. Sorry, I was looking at my book and I did not see the admit button.
That's okay, thank you.
But we are going over verse 4 right now, where the opponent introduces the idea. The hypothetical interlocutor is introducing the definition of fuel as that which is being burned. Yeah, and I think what I got from verse 4 is basically that all this does is define fuel as being dependent on fire and not independent of fire. Because fuel that's not being burned is not technically fuel. It's just a material that could be fuel. So it has that potential existence. But
then this again seems like, I mean, I'm sure there is, and I'll have to think for a second too. Yeah, I think I know what the charitable interpretation of this is, but at first glance, this again seems to be a conflation between notional and existential dependence. But I think maybe the correct way to interpret this is in the same case as in the existential dependence of cause on effect, where some people say the way to interpret this is there's obviously a notional dependence of cause on effect, but if we take the cause to be a composite, then if we think, as Buddhists tend to think, that composites are not ultimately real, but rather are conceptual constructs, then any composite that exists with notional dependence upon something else, since composites are conceptual constructs, will exist with existential dependence on that other thing. And I think we could say the same thing here, right? Any given fuel from a Buddhist perspective isn't going to be real because it'll be composite, right? A block of coal we see as a unity, but really it's a plurality of dharmas or whatever. So if we take then a block of fuel to be notionally dependent for being what it is on fire, then it's also existentially dependent upon that, because it's independence upon us having that notion that we even bother to gather these particular things together to make this composite instead of some other composite. I think that this could be a way to explain why there's existential dependence, seemingly existential dependence coming out of notional dependence. Not 100% sure though.
And how exactly are you relating that to that verse?
Well, they are saying that we can say fuel is what is burned by fire, and thus they can be independent of each other, while also be sort of dependent on what they can be independent entities and yet so distinct but dependent. But then, as the commentary says, the point of this verse is that if fuel is by definition what is burned by fire, then fuel can be said to exist only when there is fire. And one would say, well, no, that's not really true, because the stuff that is there, even when it's not on fire, and thus not, we wouldn't apply the notion fuel to it, still exists because it is what it is by its nature, and fuel is an accidental thing that we then attribute to it. But if in the same way as with, attributing the notion of creating some effect to some causal field or composite, similarly, we do the same thing to some composite items that are the fuel items, and then we apply the notion of fuel to them. So if they are notionally dependent on fire because they have to be burned by fire to be fuel, then they're also existentially dependent on fire because they are composites brought together by human minds for some purpose in some kind of account. Basically, I'm saying the notional dependence to existential dependence move could be made by considering that fuels, usually being composites and not simples, are having unity imputed onto them by humans. And thus the unified entity, block of coal, does actually depend upon our notions about coal. And thus the notional dependence, fuel being defined as what is burned by fire, becomes existential dependence.
Maybe I'm not understanding you, but I'm not quite getting how the notional dependence leads to the existential dependence.
I'll send
I can add to this, because I had the same concern here as Sagar, and I was not sure. I mean, it almost seems like Nāgārjuna is begging the question if he defines fuel as that which is burned by fire, then we're just saying look, you've already won the argument, and of course fuel is dependent on fire if you define it as dependent on fire. In which case, the idea here is, are they only notionally dependent? Can you only understand this concept of fuel with reference to fire and vice versa? But I take it that Sagar, your response, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, but if we understand fuel not as we would typically understand fuel, but as the causal nexus of that which contributes to fire, so something like fuel, oxygen, heat, and all the causal conditions in order for fire to actually be burned, then of course by definition it will be that which is burned to create fire, because that's what we're attempting to name by the concept fuel.
So that's not really what I'm trying to say. I'm trying to take, basically, I just sent 4 pages from a book by Jan Westerhoff about Nāgārjuna. They sent 4 pages, and this is about the interdependence of cause and effect, which is obviously effect depends on cause, but also that cause depends on effect, which I think illustrates a similar issue in that seemingly the only dependence that cause has on effect, or rather that, yeah, the only dependence that cause has on effect is notional dependence. Seemingly it's not existential dependence. And Westroff explains, starting in the third image that I sent, from such a reading can be supported if one considers an entire causal field, is basically Westerhoff's explanation of how to read an idea of strong existential dependence of cause on effect. And I think that the same argument he presents here, of a causal field being a cognitive artifact, a collection of objects assembled with the sole purpose of explaining why a particular effect came about, if divorced from this explanatory role, there's no use for introducing the concept at all, could be applicable in this context as well. Essentially saying a pile of fuel is a cognitive artifact, a collection of objects assembled with the sole purpose of explaining why a particular effect, the fire, came about.
Yeah, I think this is what I was trying to say. I mean, so like, you know, the obvious response to Nāgārjuna would just be, well, why can't fuel exist prior to the burning of the fuel to create fire, and why can't it exist after? And then while it's burning, we can say that it's creating fire. Of course, without you know, the obvious response to a 3 times argument from the Madhyamaka, we could also just understand fuel as not the you know, the substance that exists prior to the fire, but rather all of the causal conditions that contribute in order to create the fire. And if we understand fuel in this way, then there's no detaching them. Like they would be both distinct and dependent, which I think is the point that is trying to be made.
Maybe I'm just thinking of it too simplistically, but it seems like anything that could be fuel is named fuel in anticipation of the function that will fulfill as fuel. But prior to the fulfilling of that function, it's not actually fuel. So there can't be so the idea that fuel is that which is being burned doesn't make sense if we say that the fuel exists before the fire.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think that this is the way that you get from notional what looks like notional dependence to existential dependence. Like, I think that is the argument, because like you can't make sense of fuel being prior to fire. And if you could, maybe then we would just say, well, okay, even if they are distinct in this way in which fuel could exist without fire, we still need these because they're notionally distinct or something like that. But the existential dependence comes on the interdependence of the fact that fire is what makes fuel fuel, and fuel is what makes fire fire.
Interesting. Yeah, maybe
I
we
don't
could
know if I'm
return.
understanding that correctly, but
Well, maybe other verses can elucidate some of those points. Maybe we can return to it. But let's move on. Okay, verse 5. If fire is other than fuel, it would not touch fuel. Not having touched, it will not burn it up. And if it does not burn it up, it will not go out. If it will not go out, then it will endure precisely as something with its own mark. And then there's an objection. So I'll read 6 and 7 because they're all sort of linked. 6 is the objection. Fire could touch fuel even though distinct from fuel, just as a woman touches a man and a man touches a woman. And 7, the reply. Fire, being distinct from fuel, would surely be able to touch fuel if fire and fuel were mutually independent. And this seems like a very simple point. I guess from what I get from here is that Nāgārjuna is making the point that fire and fuel cannot be so distinct that they have no way to actually relate to each other, because only things of a similar nature can actually relate to each other. Things of very different natures cannot relate to each other because they share no common property or medium by which they actually influence or affect each other. The objection by the opponent is sort of by analogy that, well, just as a woman touches a man and a man touches a woman, so we can say that fire can touch fuel. So the point here is that actually two distinct things can come into contact. And Nāgārjuna's response here is that, I guess number 7 is basically saying that if fire and fuel were mutually independent, like we know that men and women are, then sure, fire and fuel would touch each other, but they're actually not mutually independent in the way men and women are. So I guess what I get from that is that we sort of already know that men and women sort of can exist relatively independent from each other, apart from each other, but we've never ever seen a case where there's fire and fuel independent of each other. We only see them together. So the analogy there just breaks down because they're not this, the difference between men and women are not the same sort of difference as between fire and fuel.
Actually, now that I think about it, then the commentary on verse 8 really elucidates the questions we were having before.
Okay.
So I think maybe we should read not just verse 8, but then like perhaps read aloud a commentary.
Sure.
I think it.
I also take it just a quick point that like men and women don't enter into causal relationship. Is that also another point here?
That's actually an interesting point. I don't think that they actually mentioned that in the commentary, but there's an interesting point as well. That's like another way that they're different. Though you can also say that like the point being refuted here is not necessarily the causal relation, but just the point of contact itself. Yeah, okay, verse 8. So yeah, I'll read the verse and then the whole paragraph commentary.
Just a quick question, because this came to mind, Kazi or Sagar, if you have an answer. Is causality in the Buddhist, maybe the Abhidharma sense, always understood as contact? Because then there would be no distinction between contact and causality, right? Because like things need to come into contact with each other to exert causal influence.
So I'm not sure in the Abhidharma, especially because in the Abhidharma, I'm pretty sure a lot of the explicit causal relation is in terms of causal fields, like there's a cause and then there's a supporting condition and so on. And I think that often there's discussion of contact between things. Say, for example, if you think of a touch sensation as being caused by some item that is touched, and also having as its condition the body as the sense organ, the body being in contact with the cause, that is the body being the supporting condition, does seem to be necessary for the sensation to come into existence. But the sensation isn't in contact with the object, right? So I think that maybe the cause and supporting condition do sometimes need to be in contact, but the cause and the effect don't.
So according to the Ayatanas and the Dhatus, and don't like sensations have their own objects, or mental phenomena have their own mental objects?
Yes. Oh, so I guess those would be in contact with their objects. I was thinking not sensation in the sense of like vijnana, which has an object, but like Okay, yeah, then I guess there would be contact.
So this is like too much of a sidestep from what we're doing, but like I generally understand when the Madhyamaka makes claims about something not existing in the causal nexus, like of objects that can exert causal influence on each other, I take this to be a claim that this object cannot exist. So like if an object or does exist substantially, right? So like if an object doesn't exist at all, it can't exert any causal influence. But if an object exists with svabhava, how could it exert causal influence? Because it's just always exhibiting its intrinsic nature. So like this would be like some kind of, I don't know, an argument against a creator god or something. Like why would a god have any kind of creative influence or power?
Yeah,
Because they would just be exerting their creative force all the time.
exactly. And this reminds me of the way the argument of the 3 times is actually applied to causation. Because if you remember, what Nāgārjuna says is if cause and effect, if cause comes before effect, then that means that something that is of the nature to cause during the time when it's causing isn't actually producing any effect, which means it's not actually the cause. But if they exist simultaneously, then which is the cause and which is the effect? And if they exist partially simultaneously, like the cause exists for a certain duration, like t equals 0 to t equals 2, and the effect exists t equals 1 to t equals 3, then during the first period when they're not overlapping, the cause, which is supposed to be of the nature to cause the effect, isn't causing the effect. And then it somehow switches to causing. When that doesn't make sense, then how could it have had as its intrinsic nature being the cause of that thing if it has to switch from causing and not causing, or rather not causing to causing? If it has a causal nature, it should, throughout its whole existence, exhibit that nature.
I take it that whenever the Madhyamaka claims that like an entity exists, like an existential claim of any sort, they're simultaneously saying it enters into a relationship of mutual dependence with all other phenomena, and it doesn't exist with svabhava and all these other claims, because this is the only way in which an entity could exist. But yeah, the causality, the nature of causality, definitely. I mean, I was also almost thinking, like, aren't almost all of the arguments in this fire and fuel chapter already covered by the causality chapter?
Maybe the causality chapter is just like a useful, like recurring source of examples, but then the other analogies are perhaps because an interlocutor might not understand the cross applicability of the example.
Yeah, I agree. A lot of these formulaic ways of interrogating a problem, asking if the 2 elements we're concerned with, if they're identical, they're different, if they come in succession, or if they come simultaneously. Yeah, those all definitely repeat. And I guess in this case, Nāgārjuna is trying to be exhaustive with the applicability of these analyses. Huang asked an interesting question in chat. I'll read. I am being an opponent of Nāgārjuna now. How about I claim the relation between fire and burning fuel is the same as the relation between COVID-19 and infected people? So I feel like I would need a little bit more elaboration on that question.
We are neither identical nor distinct from the COVID virus.
Well, I feel like here it's slightly different if you think about what I was saying with the man and woman thing. Oh my God, no, they said infected people. So yeah, I guess, well, you can have the COVID-19 virus without having people, whereas you can't have fire or fuel without each other. So there's one difference there. Yeah, I don't know. It's an interesting thing. Maybe we can think back on that at the end of this chapter when we sort of generalize the analysis of fire and fuel to all things, and it would if COVID-19 counts as part of all things. So okay, yeah, verse 8, I'll read that, and I'll also read the whole commentary, because yeah, on Sagar, I agree, it is very helpful to elucidate some of the concerns we had previously. 8, if fire depends on fuel and fuel depends on fire, which of the two is arisen first, fuel or the fire that is dependent on that? So the commentary says, the argument against mutual dependence of fire and fuel involves investigating the question of whether they exist simultaneously or in succession. Oh wait, actually, before we go too deeply in that, I actually have made in my notes that, give me 1 second. Did you guys get a sense that verses 1 through 7, we were actually analyzing fire and fuel as if they were independent of each other. And now we're starting to deal with fire and fuel as if they were mutually dependent on each other. Are you guys seeing that pattern?
Yeah, and then like I think he wants to establish that they can't be independent, and in the dependence arguments, he seems to be then going to the 3 times to like, to kind of deliver the final blow about any sort of relationship between fire and fuel.
Right, cool. Yeah, I just wanted to point that out as like sort of the general pattern of these verses. Okay, so again, the commentary. The argument against mutual dependence of fire and fuel involves investigating the question of whether they exist simultaneously or else in succession. Suppose they exist in succession, and it is fuel that exists first. Chandrakirti says there would follow the absurd consequences that fuel could exist unlit, and things like grass would all count as fuel. These consequences might not strike us as absurd. Buddha Palita says, we must understand the dependence of fuel on fire as conceptual. By this, he seems to mean that we see something as fuel only because we anticipate the arising of fire. But this would seem to leave open the possibility that fuel might exist in the unlit state. What Buddha Palita's comment brings out, however, is that when we think of fuel as something that can exist both before the fire and also when there is fire, this, quote, fuel is something we have conceptually constructed. Anything that could exist in either the unlit state or the lit state must be made of parts. So by fuel, we mean something ultimately real, and fuel is related to fire. Fuel can only exist when there is fire. Yeah. I think I actually kind of get now what you guys mean by the notional dependence on fuel does actually lead to its existential dependence. Because yeah, in that moment, the fuel does require the fire to actually endow it the property of fuel, while at the same time it's still a dependent designation as it being fuel, because it wasn't fuel before the fire.
So I have a thought which may be completely off the mark, but I haven't read this Westerhoff paper that Sagar was talking about, but perhaps is the way that Nāgārjuna would be making this move from notional to existential dependence is, especially with reference to the first chapter on causality, just so like, making this point that there is this notional dependence of fuel and fire, and then making this like this, having this second premise be, look, causality is just a notional concept because it requires conceptual superimposition of our mind onto like the causal objects out there in the world. And with the second premise, then you can just go to, well, if causality is a notional concept to begin with, and we've shown that cause and effect are notional and fire and fuel are notional, therefore, they are existentially dependent on each other.
I like this idea a lot. This is not what the Westerhoff paper is not actually talking about the notionality of causal dependence being applied to this, but rather of mereological dependence. The Westerhoff thing is saying, well, if these two things are notionally dependent on one another, and each of them is mereologically dependent on something else, then in being mereologically dependent on something else, they themselves are conceptual constructs, and two notionally dependent conceptual constructs are existentially dependent because they are themselves notions. So he frames it from a mereology point of view. But the basic form of the argument, now that I think of it because you just said it, is really just these two things stand in mutual notional dependence. These two things have existential dependence in some fashion that makes them like notional entities. Therefore, their existential dependence is their notional dependence implies their existential dependence as well. And so you can do that with mereological dependence. You can do it with causal dependence. Once we've established that causal dependence is notional, that it occurs within like a sort of notional reference frame or a conceptual reference frame. Yeah, I like that.
It's almost
Can
like
we
we
say
do
that about-
Nāgārjuna. Oh, sorry.
Okay, well, can we say that about conceptual dependence as well?
Well, but the thing is that here we're establishing conceptual dependence. So then that almost starts to sound like you're saying, yeah, these are conceptually dependent. These are conceptually dependent because they are conceptually dependent in this other way. Well, if you had already shown they were conceptually dependent in that other way, then why show that they're conceptually dependent again?
Sure, but I guess you can make the subtle mistake, I guess, that the things that which are conceptually constructed are intrinsically conceptually constructed, or something. And so you need that second level to remind yourself that even this process of conceptual imputation itself is like a conceptual idea that we have that is still effective, which makes the conceptual imputation possible, but that I think this might be similar to the problem with the appropriator, where there's an appropriation happening, but at the same time, there's no actual appropriation happening. So like conventionally, there's conceptual designation, but ultimately there isn't, even when we're doing it.
Is the idea then to deny that there are like a world of objects out there that don't have existence unto themselves, but we can only construct them in particular combinations of constructions, right? Like this would be for conceptual construction to exist with Swabhava, the idea that the world exists in such a way that it can only be conceptually constructed in particular variations or methods.
That does seem like a dangerous error. I hadn't thought of that before. That's really
but to deny this claim is to then say, actually, there's like an infinitude of ways in which the world could be conceptually constructed or something.
Yeah, and it kind of, I don't know if any of you know anything about Nelson Goodman and Nelson Goodman's philosophy. Nelson Goodman also has a constructivist theory. He calls his own position irrealism, which is, according to him, roughly the claim that the world dissolves into versions. And what he means by versions is a little bit unclear, but I think what he kind of means by versions are these ways of constructing the world, of which he thinks there are an infinite possibility of them, and that it just happens that at certain times some are instantiating, but they could be otherwise, and there's nothing even fixed about our capacities as conceptual constructors to make it such that we construct this kind of world. And that's what this reminds me of.
Would he say that, like, even though, I guess if I'm getting it right, that the only access we have to a real is our versions that we construct, but does that also imply that reality is a composition of versions?
Yes, exactly. So it's actually really interesting.
So that's kind of reifying a bit.
He says something quite interesting, which is that the sentence, "the earth is at rest," which is a false sentence, but seems true, which we would take to just be a false sentence, that would only seem true from a geocentric model, he would say, no, that sentence is just elliptical. When a person, before we discovered the heliocentric model, was saying that, that sentence, it should be understood as elliptical. For a statement that occurs with reference to a certain version. And the same thing then for statements like the earth moves, being like a statement which is made with reference to a certain version.
So it sounds like to me like if you've heard in the kind of literature and epistemology, this idea of an epistemic system, like the truth or falsity of a claim can only be measured with respect to the available evidence within the background of a particular epistemic system.
Right, and so then
so the earth is flat thing would then be like, okay, well, they had good evidence within their epistemic system to believe this, so.
It kind of reminds me of how Nāgārjuna, in some of his other writings that talk a little bit about epistemology, he almost frames a mutual dependence again, but between epistemic instruments being ones that we think are legitimate and epistemic objects, and says that these are these exist in mutual dependence, that there's a kind of indiscernible, of indiscernible origin sense in which we take things to be objects of knowledge because we came into acquaintance with them with certain mechanisms like reasoning or perception or whatever that we take to be the knowledge producing ones. But we take those to be the knowledge producing ones because of past acquaintance with certain objects that we've sort of considered to be the ones that are objects of knowledge, as opposed to objects of illusion or something. And so there's a mutual dependence between epistemic objects and epistemic instruments. And so neither is said to be unreal, but also like that's not to deny that conventionally we're correct in speaking as though we have knowledge when we say that we have knowledge, but it also is to problematize taking our knowledge to be something ultimate and foundational, or like well-founded, I guess.
Well, so I'm reading the Vidalia Prakarana, right? And
oh yeah,
like what Westerhoff's interpretation of what you just said is like, okay, he says it seems to, based on this idea of mutual dependence between the pramanas and the prameyas, it seems to me that Nāgārjuna is advocating a kind of coherentist epistemology, where your beliefs are true or false or regarded as epistemically sound with respect to the beliefs that you already hold and how well it coheres to those beliefs. Now, I guess my question is like, is that really true for Nāgārjuna? Like, I'm not sure. And Westerhoff like makes this very weak claim too. He's like, perhaps coherentism is the view that would fit best with what Nāgārjuna is saying here, and like, you know, it is a weak claim that he's making, but I mean, I'm not sure. I think I would challenge this. I think doesn't he seem to be more of like, it's not easy to fit Nāgārjuna into any scheme of knowledge, but I would say he's closer to skepticism than coherentism. But probably probably combination of those though, because he's not also saying that knowledge isn't possible at all.
I also agree with some combination, because I don't think that he's a skeptic, because he does seem to accept lots of things as knowable.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
But then to attribute a pure, like, if we want to think of a foundationalist coherentism to him, is also wrong, because I don't think it would be correct to say that he sees there as being a web of beliefs which cohere with each other and which like collectively ground the whole system together. That's not acceptable, because then that's sneaking in foundationalism into your coherentism. For it to be the real kind of coherentism that I think Nāgārjuna is talking about, there has to be each level, each individual belief seems to have its justification, but there can't be any way that you end the justification descent or circle.
I guess there's like a pros and cons to this view, because I would then say, so I could ask, you subject to this to the Madhyamaka analysis, this coherentist picture, and say, well, how is it that the beliefs hang together with other beliefs? Like, what's the relation? And then, does the relation exist with Swabhava? How do the beliefs relate to each other? Okay, and then, the coherentist picture collapses. So this is a reason as to why Nāgārjuna might not be a coherentist.
But you could make that argument then to say the same thing. Well, here's a reason why Nāgārjuna doesn't ascribe to the doctrine of Nisvabhava too, because I think the point of the Madhyamaka analysis is if the point is to go sort of to something without reference points and without conceptual proliferation, prapancha, then prapancha about Madhyamika topics too is also something that Nāgārjuna would go beyond. So I think if we want to make the argument that, Nāgārjuna could find a way to deconstruct even the coherentism that sort of models how Nāgārjuna deconstructs epistemology, would be like, saying, well, it's just to say that Madhyamika is in a queer way seemingly self-undermining. And I guess that's true of all of its parts, of the metaphysical parts, of the epistemological parts.
Well, I mean, and also people have, if we were to say that they're skeptical, I mean, there's been many realists and throughout the history of philosophy that have pointed out that skepticism is self-undermining as well. So
I'm wondering though, is Madhyamaka necessarily self-undermining if it doesn't propose anything in the first place?
This is like Vigrahavivartani verse 29, right?
Yeah,
if I had a thesis, then the fault would apply to me, but I have no thesis.
I mean, I see how the self-undermining idea is very attractive to interpret Nāgārjuna's project here, but yeah, I feel like if nothing's actually being asserted, then nothing's necessarily being undermined. There is certain elements, which we'll find later, where I guess like Nāgārjuna helps us save ourselves from reifying Madhyamaka analysis. So like when bringing up emptiness, we also emphasize the emptiness of emptiness. But I don't think that's necessarily, for example, a self-undermining, but more so a kind of a clarification of what the emptiness is actually doing.
And we're employing emptiness for a specific function,
right,
which is to dispel a certain thing, not to create an entity that we want to assent to the existence of.
Right. And Nāgārjuna does undermine the idea of holding emptiness as inherently existing, but rather than being like a self-undermining of his own view, it's more so like a way to save us from that potential mistake that we can make.
So I came upon this Motilal article from 1970. I'm forgetting. I think it's called Reference in Nyaya and Buddhist Logic. And it explained to me just like what you guys are talking about here really well, in this idea of like the theory of error that both these schools have, right? For the Nyayikas, the theory of error they have is that, you can't talk about anything that doesn't exist, but error comes into place when you misattribute a property to an existent entity. So if something is like red and you say it's blue or something, then you're mistaken. But on the other hand, for the Madhyamaka, you can talk about non-existent entities. And error actually comes when we imbue existence onto things that don't actually have existence. So like reificationism. And the dilemma here posed to the Madhyamaka of whether or not it's self-undermining can be posed with Nyaya or Buddhist understandings of reference and theories and their respective error theories, right? So for the Madhyamaka, it's like no problem. Like we can talk about things that don't exist. We can talk about all of this. It's pure fictional discourse. But the problem is when we treat it as it does exist. So for the Madhyamaka, there's no dilemma. is the point, right?
Yeah, this kind of reminds me of a debate that has gone on to some extent in English-speaking Theravada Buddhism between Thanissaro Bhikkhu and Bhikkhu Bodhi on whether anatta, which is anatman in Sanskrit, that doctrine, is supposed to be ontological, which is what Bhikkhu Bodhi thinks, or strategic, which is what Thanissaro Bhikkhu thinks. And what Thanissaro Bhikkhu thinks he means when he says is strategic is, so I'll actually,
would upaya be a good translation of what he thinks it is?
I actually kind of think that even though he's very interesting, he sometimes seems like his interpretation of Theravada is in a way that makes it seem like very much like he's touching on Mahayana ideas, but he's also very much of the opinion, as are his students, that the Mahayana is the counterfeit dharma described in the sutras concerning how a counterfeit dharma will appear in the future. He thinks that, like, he thinks that, for example, yeah, so it's really funny. He thinks that the Prajnaparamita Sutras are the first emergence of this counterfeit dharma, because like the Diamond Sutra talks about how you have to like give up the dharma in order to attain enlightenment, which can't be true or whatever. But yet there's in a collection of his essays called Noble Strategy, there is an essay in it on what he says to be the Theravada understanding of emptiness, sunyata in Pali, in which he says, emptiness is a mode of perception, a way of looking at experience. It adds nothing to and takes nothing away from the raw data of physical and mental events. You look at events in the mind of the senses with no thought of whether there's anything lying behind them. Isn't this the same thing as saying not existing from its own side? Or it seems to me like it's saying that. He says this mode is called emptiness because it's empty of the presuppositions we usually add to experience to make sense of this. Isn't this just describing emptiness as nishprapancha, which is what Nāgārjuna says too? Anyway, I feel like this is very funny.
But there may be a crucial difference here in that it does, from what you explained, it doesn't seem to me that they're making any metaphysical claims, right? Like they're just saying this is how we should view the world, and you know, depending on what the whole point of this is or the end goal.
Sure.
It's
yes.
not to make this further step that objects don't exist from their own side. It's just we should see objects as if they didn't exist from their own side. But like,
right.
why is the next question I would ask?
That we should do that, because I think then he would, so I think basically what you're saying is this emptiness mode of perception merely pragmatically useful but not in line with reality, or is it in line with reality? Because if it's the second, then this would be to make, I think, this very same claim as the Prajnaparamita Sutras, which he says are counterfeit. But if he thinks that it's just pragmatic, if it's just pragmatic, then, and not supposed to be in line with it, then we might raise the question, well, then why are we trying to cultivate that mode of perception at all, if it's not because that's really the way it is?
The thing about this pragmatic view is that it almost seems to, at least in principle, open the possibility that there could be things that are not empty. Whereas I feel like the Madhyamaka view is that categorically, there's nothing that is not empty. So I feel like there's that subtle distinction there. But at the same time, it's not ontological because we're not saying that like reality is made of emptiness or
right.
So it's like I guess like what's the middle way between these two views?
So I actually briefly, I kind of got off topic, but the thing that Thanissaro Bhikkhu says with his strategic interpretation of anatta is thinking that given the thoroughness with which the Buddha teaches not self, one should draw the inference that there is no self. But what Thanissaro Bhikkhu says is no, actually, the view I have no self is just as much a doctrine of self as the view I have a self. Because the act of clinging involves what the Buddha calls I-making, the creation of a sense of self, if one were to cling to the view that there is no self, one would be creating a very subtle sense of self around that view. But as he says, the Dhamma is taught for the elimination of all view positions, determinations, biases, inclinations, and obsessions, for the pacification of all fabrications, the relinquishing of all acquisitions, the end of craving, dispassion, cessation, unbinding. So thus it is important to focus on how the Dhamma is taught. Even in his most thoroughgoing teachings about not self, the Buddha never recommends replacing the assumption that there is a self with the assumption that there is no self. Instead, he only goes as far as to point out the drawbacks of various ways of conceiving the self and then to recommend dropping them.
Yeah, it's kind of like detailing this ego trap, right? Like if I'm with a bunch of people and I'm like, wow, I can't believe I'm the only one that sees through the fact that there is no self. I can't believe no one else has seen through this. And it's like, yeah, I mean, this is very dangerous, I think.
Yes,
There is something
and
else
I think that you can apply. Sorry, I'll let you do it. But I was bringing this up because I think that what Thanissaro Bhikkhu says here about not drawing from the deployment of the concept of not self, not getting drawn thus into the doctrine, there is no self, I think could perhaps be relevant in Madhyamaka as well with respect to emptiness, perhaps.
This is kind of the move Evan Thompson makes in the last chapter of Waking, Dreaming, and Being, where he says, look, no self and self doctrines both depend on this supposition that the concept of self is an essence or a substance of some kind. But rather, if we deny this presupposition and understand self as a process, which he does, and that's his thesis, then, you know, we don't have to succumb to no self or self. We don't have to get embroiled in this debate. It's like a non-issue.
Right, because the very presupposition of the question, the concept being deployed in either answer to the question, is a concept you don't even think has any real reference points in the world in the first place. So how could you give an answer to either? How could you give an answer one way or another to the question?
But like, I will say that Buddhists usually don't mind that there's no reference points to what they're talking about, right? Like, this is what I've noticed.
This is like the Buddha mentions in one sutra, that the Arahant, even though he has completely destroyed the Arahant, even though he's destroyed I-making, still uses the personal pronoun because that's the way of that's the world's manner of speaking. It's really funny because someone actually in that sutra comes up to him and is like, so you talk about all like getting rid of I-making. Do Arhats not use the first person pronoun? And then it's like, no, they could use the first person pronoun. It's so funny to me, actually.
No, it's hilarious. It's like, I don't know, just imagining this like really like violent, strict Buddhist cult that like as soon as you say I, they like off you or something.
So one point that I wanted to make that I just thought of, not sure how like applicable it is. It definitely seems like the strategic view of non-self sounds very attractive, but if Buddha sees things the way they are, and if we sort of assume that only things of like natures can actually sort of affect or receive one another, then how can we actually be certain that this mind of emptiness actually accords with the way things really are if it's just purely a pragmatic device? Do you get what I'm saying? If like there's got to be something about emptiness that is within what we're actually seeing as empty for that sort of so for that relationship between reality as for that relationship between the awakened mind and suchness to be there at all. So I feel like while I don't want to go to Bodhi's view that like emptiness, that non-self is sort of this ontological findable reality, yeah, I see there's something problematic, I think, about this sort of more pragmatist view, because we can't actually like be sure that that the mind of emptiness actually accords with reality as the way it is. It just might make it a helpful thing, but it doesn't have that robust confidence that that it sees things the way they are. I don't know. And if you say that the way that things are is yeah, I don't know what I'm saying.
I think one possible answer to this, and like one plausible reading of Nāgārjuna that I've seen, is that, I mean, he would deny that there is something such as a world in itself to begin with. So all we can get access to is something pragmatic. Like, we can't, this is the farthest we can go. So like the answer as to why stop at the pragmatic and why not go to like the axis of the world as it is that, well, all we have is the pragmatic. This is the view. I don't know.
No, it does make things complicated, because seeing things as they are technically is to see things as empty. So I guess that's how it wraps back to that, the mind of emptiness, seeing things as empty. Yeah, no, so that's interesting discussion there. I guess like the thing I tend to do when I see these sort of diametrically opposed views is to see what they share in common. So, I mean, I know this is sort of a tangential a little bit to the reading, but if we can wrap up this discussion about these two views with Thanissaro and Bhikkhu Bodhi, what can we say that they both have to assume in order for them to make their respective views? Is that something we can identify right now? Like, what do they both assume for Bhikkhu Bodhi to say that no self is ontological, and for Thanissaro to say it's merely strategic?
I think the latter would have to say that, again, there is no epistemic access to a world as it is, in which case the best we can get at either is that there is no such thing as the world as itself, or we can't get access to it, so we might as well just deal with what is pragmatic and what leads us to, upaya or psychological success. Also, I have to go, unfortunately, but this was really great discussion. It was a lot of fun, and I hope I didn't derail the conversation too much.
Oh no, you're fine. It was fun.
All right, see everyone.
See ya.
Bye.
Well, I'll just wrap up what I was thinking. I'm not sure if this is actually going to go anywhere, but I wonder if, like, obviously I have to actually read the sort of debate itself, but I wonder if they both see non-self as a kind of implicative negation, and then they're sort of debating on what kind of implicative negation it is, where maybe it's Bhikkhu Bodhi. So if they render it as an actual absence of some kind, Bhikkhu Bodhi might say that emptiness is or that view, okay, instead of saying their names, I'll just say ontological view and strategic view. I guess the ontological view could say that emptiness is ontologically real and it's an ontological absence. The strategic view could be about cultivating pragmatically this ontological absence, or this seeming ontological absence, to counter this tendency towards self. But maybe that's what they share in common, that emptiness is seen as just this mere absence. And that, so it actually makes it that their two opposed views are actually not necessarily opposed, because they both share an underlying assumption that the Madhyamaka might say is incorrect, where non-self is not an absence per se, but rather it's just the inapplicability of self.
Right. The concept not finding purchase in anything.
Right. Yeah. So I feel like that's maybe how the Madhyamika goes beyond these two dichotomous views, and if that's correct, then that debate is kind of fruitless. If the underlying view of anatta is as mere absence, but I don't know. I guess we should keep going so that we can get to the next chapter. Where were we? Oh, I don't think I actually read the commentary for 8. So, but we're also a little lower on time. So let me think for real quick how to do this fast. Okay, I think I'll just read some of my notes. So with verse 8, if I'll read that. If fire depends on fuel and fuel depends on fire, which of the two is arisen first, fuel or the fire that is dependent on that? So here we're, so now at this point, we're moving on to the phase in which the opponent accepts that fire and fuel exist in mutual dependence, and not one of them being independent of the other. And right now we're analyzing it in terms of successive mutual dependence. So let's say they are, fire comes before fuel, or fuel becomes, or fire exists before fuel, or fuel exists before fire, while still being mutually dependent. So we're analyzing that, and that's what 8 sort of asks. Which of the two is arisen first? In verse 9, if fire is dependent on fuel, then there is the establishing of an already established fire. If so, then also fuel would come to be without relation to fire. So here we're analyzing the point where fuel comes before fire, and that fire depending on that fuel. Dependence. So here it doesn't work, and we get this problem of double establishment, because dependence, so fire depending on fuel, a fuel that came prior, implies that that fire already exists, because for something to actually depend on something else, it actually has to exist. But we cannot then posit a dependence relationship to establish that fire, because then that would be to establish what is already established. Let's see. I don't think I actually went through that very coherently. Fire cannot be dependent on fuel if fire does not exist. Yeah, so it seems like here, to basically posit a dependence relationship is to establish that relationship. So and by virtue of that, establishing the things that are coming into relation. So we can't try to establish fire upon fuel if they're already mutually dependent, because that would mean that fire is already established. Would you guys consider this a form of circular reasoning, this fallacy? Or maybe it's just sort of this accidental double establishing that's happening. Well, we can move on. So yeah, so here we so in 8 and 9 we sort of analyzed mutual dependence in terms of succession and find some issues with that. Now we can ask the question, maybe, do they exist simultaneously and in mutual dependence? And this I find actually interesting. So verse 10 is, if an entity X is established independence on something else Y, and independence on that very entity X, there is established that Y on which X's establishment depends, then what is dependent on what? So that kind of reads really confusing, but I think what it's basically saying is that if two things are said to exist simultaneously, but also being mutually dependent, we sort of can't establish. So for a dependence relationship to be established, the things that are being brought into relation have to be established. But if each of the thing can only be established by reference to the other, then we're never able to actually establish anything. So that's why Nāgārjuna asked, then what is dependent on what? Each time we try to establish one thing as being dependent on another, we have to first establish that thing as being dependent. And there's never a point at which we actually establish anything as existent, and so we can't even establish that mutual dependence relation either, in only ultimate sense. And the commentary states, if fire truly depends on fuel, then fuel must first exist before there can be fire. But if fuel in turn depends on fire, it cannot exist prior to fire. The mutual dependence that the opponent claims to hold between fire and fuel, or by extension between persons and skandhas, appears to be incoherent. Yeah, so there's no way to actually ground that relationship if each thing within the relationship requires the other thing to do the establishing. And in turn, that thing that will do the establishing also requires establishing. So we're almost like in this constant circle that that doesn't allow us to actually establish anything. So it's kind of incoherent notion to then at some point say that they're mutually dependent. I think verse 11 sort of just elaborates on that a little bit. The entity that is established in dependence on something else, how does it, before being established, depend on that? But if it is something established that is dependent on something else, it is not right to say it depends on something else. The commentary states, what is it that is established in dependence on something else? Before something is brought into existence, it cannot be said to be dependent on something else. But if it already exists, how can it be called dependent? For it to be dependent, is for it to stand in need of something else for its existence. And then verse 12 is very simple. It basically outlines all the exhaustive possibilities where we can try to ground the relationship between fire and fuel in any ultimately real way. So according to 12, fire is not dependent on fuel. Fire is not independent of fuel. Fuel is not dependent on fire, and fuel is not independent of fire. Verse 13, fire does not come from something else. Fire is not found in fuel. As for fuel, the same can be said of it was said of the present. The same thing can be said of it as was said of the presently being traversed, the traversed, and the not yet traversed. So the first part of that verse, when we say that fire does not come from something else, then we kind of say that, okay, if fire exists, but it doesn't necessarily come from something else, we say that we're basically saying that fire is uncaused. And that doesn't make sense because that, one of the consequences of that is that fire is already always existing, or even that fire can come from anything. Fire is not found in fuel. If fire is found in fuel as like its latent potential to manifest, then the argument that Chandrakirti presents is that, well, we need something to manifest that quality within the fuel of fire for fire to arise. But then what about that manifestation? Does that manifestation, is that other than that fuel, or is it also a part of it? Is also found in it. And that kind of mediator between the fuel and the fire that's imminent to it also needs to be grounded in a similar way. So then we kind of have an infinite regress of points of mediation to allow that imminent fire to manifest from the fuel. But because we get infinite regress, we can never actually account for how that fire already in the fuel actually comes to manifest. And the second part of verse 13 is a reference to the 3 times argument. It's particularly referencing back to motion. So rather than the traverse, it's the burned. So the burning Burning is not found in the already burned because it's already burned. Burning is not found in the yet to be burned because what is yet to be burned is not burning. And there's no present state of burning to be found. And I actually found that this example of fire and fuel helped me a little bit more in understanding this present part of the 3 times argument. Because every time you look at fire and you're trying to identify what you're looking at as the present moment, what you're seeing is an instance of fire having already burned. So, or within that same instance, you can anticipate a fire to happen. But in that case, all you're working with is just fire that's already burned or yet to be burned. So every time you think you found a present, it's either what's already being burned or just your anticipation of it. So the present kind of always escapes us. So we can never ground traversion, motion, burning, or anything in the present. And this verse 14 is cool because it sort of outlines what's being called the 5-fold examination. It's an interesting device that helps us analyze any existent. So here, with reference to fire, again, fire is not fuel. Fire is not elsewhere than where fuel is. Fire does not possess fuel. Fuel is not in fire, and fire is not in fuel.
I found this part very helpful for understanding the like previous verses.
Yeah, totally.
The commentary here in particular.
Yeah, and it's super cool because it sort of gives out a little list, like a little toolkit of modes of arguing that we can apply. Yeah, and it seems exhaustive. And then with 15 and 16, with 15, Nāgārjuna is basically generalizing the relationship between the analysis of fire and fuel to all things. So 15, always without remainder of explaining subject and the appropriator, along with the pot, the clock, and the like, are to be understood in terms of fire and fuel. So every time we have a relationship in which there's a subject and something being appropriated or taken up by the subject, all of the analyses that we've conducted on fire and fuel should also apply to them, which basically points out that what we're really analyzing this whole time is this sort of abstract relation between a subject and what it appropriates or takes up as its own. And then 16, it basically says that, whoever describes, I'll just read it. 16, they are not considered by us to be wise instructors in the teachings of the Buddha who describe the subject and existence, i.e. the appropriated in terms of identity and difference. So any teaching or view that bases the relationship between a subject and what it's appropriating as either being identical or different, independent or dependent, are not in accordance with the Buddha's Buddhist way, the Buddhist teaching. And I think it's nice to read the very last 2 sentences of this chapter's commentary. Investigation has revealed that it cannot be ultimately true that fire and fuel stand in anything like the appropriated relation, whether they are identical or distinct. Just as fire and fuel cannot be said to be either identical or distinct, so the appropriating subject and the existing states that are to be appropriated, such as vision and feeling, cannot be described as identical or distinct either. Well, that was chapter 10. And now chapter 11, which is a lot more short and easier to understand, but also very insightful.
You mean a lot more short.
Yeah, a lot more short. Yeah. So here we're analyzing. The parts of samsara, particularly the sort of 12-fold links of dependent origination, the 12-fold account, as a beginningless series, and we're basically, I think what he ends up arguing for is that there's no ultimately real prior or posterior part of any part of the sequence, precisely because of its beginninglessness. So verse 1, the great sage, the Buddha, declared that the prior part of samsara cannot be discerned. Samsara is without first and last. It has no beginning and end. So the commentary goes on here to sort of clarify that when we're saying that samsara is without end, we're not contradicting the point that nirvana entails the end of samsara. But rather, when we're saying that samsara is without first and last, that it has no beginning and end, it's to say that it's non-denumerable, so that we can't actually count the series to a beginning point in the with an origin. And because we can't count back, we can't necessarily count forward either. So and I think the really good example for this, why we can say that samsara as a beginningless series has no end, while not saying that, while not contradicting that nirvana is the end of samsara, is the analogy of negative numbers. So no matter how far back we count the negative numbers, we'll always keep going back. There's no beginning to the negative numbers. Just, it just goes infinitely. But we're not saying there's no actual end to the series, because -1 would be the end of the series of negative integers. Yeah. So number, yeah.
So actually, you should read number 2 first, because what I was going to say.
Yeah. Okay, good, yeah. So verse 2, how could there be a middle of that which lacks a beginning and an end? Thus here there cannot be a series in which one precedes another, one succeeds another, or two occur simultaneously. So, and yeah.
What I was going to say is I've actually been taught once a meditation on, like a contemplation meditation on something very similar to this verse. So it was cool when I read it, which was not to think about samsara as a whole and not being able to find a sort of middle in it, but rather the mind stream as a whole. And because of not being able to find a middle of it, likewise, and this goes then into like the birth being prior, old age and death being posterior, not being able to find the beginnings or endpoints of particular thoughts, despite the fact that generally in our accounts of our own mind, we imagine thoughts as discrete entities occurring at particular times. And I thought that was an interesting parallel and like a microcosm of this macrocosm, like samsara, you can't find the beginning and ends of particular marking events in samsara, like birth and death and so on. Also, in a sort of smaller scale, you can't find the beginnings and ends of little events in other processes that are seemingly never ending within samsara. That was all I wanted to share.
Super cool. And because, and that makes sense because, thoughts are a part of samsara, so it'll have the same character, I guess. It's actually also, I'm not sure how relevant this is, but it actually did make me think about, some sort of conversations, dialectics within Madhyamika about the nature of the middle in Madhyamika. The idea that it's really easy to make the mistake that that the Madhyamaka entails a kind of middle position between two extremes. And that only makes sense if the extremes of eternalism or nihilism or annihilationism actually are coherent in any established way. And then you can say that there's a kind of middle view between those two views. But the point is that the Madhyamaka is not merely a kind of geometrical center that lies between two definitive extremes, but that, you know, in the very from a Madhyamaka analytic point of view, that either any view based on eternalism or annihilationism kind of can never actually establish itself because it's an incoherent idea. So in a way, the extremes exist, but not in any actually foundational way. So there can't be any foundational existence to the Madhyamaka either. So this is why someone like Mipam, Ju Mipam Gyatso will use this idea of the non-abiding middle. You know, it's in a middle that we don't abide within, because to think that we abide in the middle is to think that, yeah, we lie in between these two definitive extremes, but even if extremes are incoherent and non-established, then the middle is something else. The middle is more so, you know, pointing out the incoherence of those two extremes rather than trying to find some kind of middle place. And I feel like there's a similar reasoning here.
This reminds me of one of the texts attributed to Maitreya, which is distinguishing the middle from extremes. But in the Dharmachakra Translation Committee's translation of it, they titled their translation "Middle Beyond Extremes," and actually their translation is accompanied by Mipam's commentary.
Oh, cool.
And so they translated Mipam's commentary on the text with it. And so instead of just translating it literally as distinguishing the middle from the extremes, they give it this translation, middle beyond the extremes, which to me almost seems appropriate in this discussion, because, you know, if the extremes are rejected, then there's not really, you're affirming some midpoint between them, because how can you find a midpoint between ends that you're not accepting? But you're instead going beyond both of them. And in that sense, it's that kind of middle beyond the extremes, not middle in between the extremes.
Right. Yeah.
But it's interesting because distinguishing the middle, like the actual text, which Mipam comments on, is the Maitreya text focusing on the Yogacara notion of the threefold svabhava and the threefold emptiness, which is this very somewhat peculiar and difficult, I think, to understand. But some people think it's compatible with Madhyamaka. For example, Jay Garfield really likes this text and thinks that the three natures, three emptinesses can talk about the same thing as Madhyamaka, just from the subject side instead of from a general perspective. But I find it quite difficult to understand the three natures, three emptinesses discussion.
Yeah, Garfield actually gave a whole lecture at I think Sarvasti Abbey on precisely that, and I found that very actually insightful, and I do think it makes sense. Though Malcolm Smith has mentioned offhandedly that he thinks that the three natures view is actually subtly internally incoherent. He never elaborated on that, so I might ask him at some point on what he means by that. Well, yeah.
So one thing that I'm a little bit confused about with this argument is so this is later applied to say you can't say that birth in this life comes before death in this life, while aging is occurring in between the two, and birth in this life is occurring after death in the last life, while death in this life is occurring before death in the next life. They want to reject this, and what they say is this assumes we can speak of this life as coming in the middle of a series of lives that includes past and future lives, and verse 2 is supposed to argue against this. What I'm not getting is, even if you can't say this life occurs in the middle of a series, couldn't this life occur in the middle of the immediately past life and the immediately present life? Or is there some problem with that too? Maybe like digging in with the negative numbers, even though there's no middle negative number, -5 is in the middle of -6 and -4, right? But maybe the reasoning here is -5 is only -5's being in the middle of -6 and -4 is just describing, if we want to really elucidate what we mean when we say that, we have to talk about, well, what's -6 and -4. And -6 and -4, then we'd be like, oh, well, they're the numbers in between these two negative numbers, and so on.
But it
And
kind of
we would just-
assumes that you do know the terminating point
right
eventually.
Yeah. So maybe that's what the argument is. That's like the implicit argument in there. But I wasn't sure.
Yeah. And then on the verse 3 and 4 basically try to posit, okay, let's say birth comes before old age and death. But I don't think we actually established this or went over this yet. So the way we're analyzing these parts of the samsaric series is specifically just with birth, old age, and death. And so for verse 3, if birth were prior and old age and death were posterior, there would be birth without old age and death, and one who had not died would be born. And here in this scheme, it's really important to point out that birth is only the consequence of a previous death. So it is important to remember in this chapter that we're dealing with this sort of like almost circular relationship where death gives rise to birth. So in that case, assuming that sort of kind of causal, non-degenerable causal series, we can't say that birth comes first, because then that would mean that there's a birth without a previous death. And verse 4, we say, okay, what if birth comes last? And suppose birth were later and old age and death came first, how could there be a causeless old age and death of one who is not born? So if we say that birth comes last, then that would mean that we have death without a birth, which doesn't make sense. We would have old age and death first, and then have birth, but then it makes no sense to say which one. It makes no sense for there to be old age and death without something being born. So neither birth, old age, or death can ever be the first in this series. Verse 5 basically says that, okay, well, they can't simultaneously exist either. We can't put any one of them before the others, but we can't put them all together at the same time, because that would basically mean that the moment that you're born, you also die, which is an incoherent idea. And that would just sort of break the whole series as a causal series. And verse 6 basically says, because of these reasons, we can't hypostatize, we can't reify that we can actually identify this is birth and this is old age and this is death in any ultimately real way, because we can never find them in the series and distinguish them from each other. And then verse 7 basically states, 7 and 8 basically generalizes this to all things that involve a succession of parts. So effect and cause, as well as the characterized and the characteristic, feeling and that which feels, and whatever other things there are. Not only is there no prior part of samsara, there is as well no prior part of any existence. So the commentary states that the analysis of this chapter applies not only to living things, but to anything the existence of which involves successive parts. These all involve succession in time, which cannot be accounted for without positing an absolute beginning, a posit that would be irrational. So there can be no account of how such things come to exist. Now, an interesting problem I am thinking of right now is that if samsara is beginningless, then does that mean ignorance is beginningless? And if ignorance is beginningless, how can ignorance end? Which seems to fly in the face of the Buddhist path, which is for a very large part of it to remove ignorance.
But here, by saying samsara is beginningless, part of what we end up entailing in that is that samsara doesn't actually involve any temporally succeeding events at all, ultimately. And if that's true, then
there is no ignorance.
Then there isn't ignorance in the sense
Right.
of mental events that bear ignorance. So at the level of analysis, where we regard beginningless samsara in the sense of a cycle that proceeds, that we can't find an origin to, and that proceeds until we end enlightenment by ending ignorance, there is ignorance. And at the level of analysis where we see, wait a second, but the lack of a beginning to samsara kind of refutes the real existence of samsara in the first place, then we say, well, then I guess there is no ignorance in the first place either. And so there's a sliding scale of analysis here, I guess. Conventionally, we are ignorant sentient beings trying to attain Buddhahood. Ultimately, there are no sentient beings. And so there are no ignorant sentient beings in the first place. It's kind of funny. There's one, I think it's the 25,000 line Prajnaparamita Sutra, where the Buddha says, and I really love this. He says, oh, it's the 10,000 line Prajnaparamita. That's what it is. He says that great compassion is defined as, okay, if you ask what is great loving kindness, it is an action in which the Tathagatas engage on behalf of all sentient beings, treating enemies and friends identically. That is called great loving kindness. If you ask what is great compassion, it is unstinting loving kindness toward all sentient beings when there are actually no sentient beings. That is called great compassion. And I really love this. I find this to be very relevant and profound in this case, where we seem to be saying at one time in Madhyamaka, here is samsara and here is how samsara works. And another time saying, well, our description of samsara kind of runs into problems that imply that there is no such thing. And I think that sort of walking in this middle of saying conventionally, yes, ultimately not taking a stance. The Buddhas have great compassion that has unstinting loving kindness towards beings without regarding there being any beings. There's another thing Chandrakirti says, which is that beings are illusory like reflections in water. Bodhisattvas, and then he doesn't say bodhisattvas nevertheless, he just says bodhisattvas see them as such and long to set them free. It's kind of funny, right? Well, bodhisattvas are seeing sentient beings as illusions, so who are they trying to set free? But nevertheless, they are trying to set them free. Bodhisattvas see beings as illusions, but long to set them free. Here, Nāgārjuna is saying, samsara, where can we find samsara? But also, he's Buddhist, so he's saying, well, we have to be free from samsara. There's a kind of interesting line between like walking in the conventional while also regarding the ultimate that's going on here. Perhaps another thing that's relevant is in the Avatansaka Sutra. There's a discussion of bodhisattvas engaging in various kinds of strange activities in order to pacify beings, while always contemplating the truth that transcends them. Which I think is perhaps also relevant.
And I guess this sort of depends on whose scheme you're using, but it does seem like, so bodhisattvas are distinguished from Buddhas in the sense that they sort of, I read it in places that they can sort of oscillate between the two truths, whereas I think this might be Tsongkhapa's presentation, that bodhisattvas can seamlessly oscillate between the two truths, whereas Buddhas abide in dharmata always.
I think that is, so Kappa, I think, frames it as like being in meditative equipoise on emptiness and being outside of it. Bodhisattvas have both, whereas a Buddha is always in what is the bodhisattva state of equipoise constantly, and their activity is just like a display, when in reality they're not actually thinking about the world as though it has non-empty things in it and really accepting these conventions, because they're stuck in equipoise.
Yeah, it's like it's interesting that I guess from the point of view of the awakened mind, we can't say, the typical Madhyamaka sort of by negation, we can't say that there's compassion or that there is no compassion, because there's no compassion because there's no subject to have compassionate, to have compassion for objects. But I guess we can't say that there's no compassion either, because the type of thing that the awakened mind is such that compassion is part of the process of getting there. So it's almost like compassion sort of carries on in its momentum from samsara into nirvana, so that while there's no compassion for something, we can't say that there's no compassion at all, because the process getting there doesn't just suddenly stop.
Mm-hmm.
Because there's no discrete moment in which we go from sentient being to Buddhahood. So yeah, so that's interesting.
There's another part in the same sutra, which is also interesting, which is where the Buddha says, those great bodhisattvas who think they should seek to train all sentient beings, and then having really set out for unsurpassed, genuinely perfect enlightenment, don their armor, resolving to train all sentient beings, might as well think they should seek to train space. If you ask why sentient beings should be regarded as voidness, that's how in this translation they translate emptiness, because space itself is void. Similarly, sentient beings should be regarded as emptiness because space itself is emptiness, and sentient beings should be regarded as essencelessness, nihisvabhava, that is, because space itself is essenceless. For this reason, divine princes, it is difficult for great bodhisattva beings who don the armor of great compassion for the sake of sentient beings who do not exist. Those who, for the sake of sentient beings, think they should don the armor of great compassion might as well think they should seek to do battle with space. And then he says, the astonishing singular difficulty is not that they do not regress to lower attainments, that is that of a Shravaka or Pratika Buddha, but that they don the armor that resolves to establish innumerable sentient beings in Buddhahood, while those beings whom they would guide are utterly non-apprehensible.
It makes me, again, this is just like at best, a conventional way of like approaching, illustratively, but oh crap, I just lost the point I was going to make. It might come back to me. Well, another point I want to make, this seems like a really nice counter to the tendency of developing a savior complex. I think that's part of like what it is, like, oh, I have to save all these sentient beings and liberate them.
Beings?
Yeah,
what
right.
Sentient beings? I don't see any. Where are they?
Right, exactly. But at the same time, it's not the case that it's not the case that there aren't sentient beings either, from a particular way of seeing things, the conventional way. So it's not like because there's no sentient beings, we shouldn't be compassionate. But because there aren't no compassion, but there aren't no beings, yeah, we're not being compassionate about something. It's very interesting thing to do.
So, Jichan, you mentioned in the chat about like maybe there's relationships further than the fivefold. Do you have an idea for a sixth way of relating in the fire of fuel example? Like, do you have a? Because I'm not actually sure. Maybe they're exhaustive. Maybe they're not. Do you have a thought as to, with the fire and fuel example, what the sixth possibility might be? I'll think about it, because but isn't that a subset of them being distinct? well, I guess it's not, I guess it's a special subset, right? If they're distinct but isomorphic to one another, what would that entail? I'm not sure. That's a very good question.
Well, I feel like in a way, the isomorphism. Actually, let me think about it. I mean, that'll just be a special case of distinctiveness, wouldn't it?
That's what I thought. But maybe as a special case of distinctiveness, it could be resistant. It's something about it could be resistant to some of the arguments Nāgārjuna makes.
I guess it almost looks like a both identical and distinct kind of position.
Yeah, a little bit. It's like distinct, but in sharing these, in having the mapping of features, it borrows some of the traits of being identical without actually having to be identical.
But at the same time, we are here dealing with fire and fuel that do have a kind of necessary relationship with each other. Whereas I feel like things which are isomorphic to each other are not always necessarily connected. Like we might identify the isomorphism, but it's not like the things that we make this sort of isomorphic relation between or identify this isomorphism with are necessarily like identical. Or it's not the case that they necessarily come into relation the way that fire and fuel do. So it's like a slightly different thing that we're being concerned about here. So for example, this might be a really obscure example. I can't think of anything more specific. There are people who claim that the way that the concepts unfold in Hegel's science of logic are actually isomorphic to the way that the different conceptual aspects of Marxist analysis of capitalism, that there's an isomorphism between the two logics. But there's no necessary relationship between Marx's Capital and Hegel's science of logic. Like they don't come together all the time, like fire and fuel do. So yeah, I don't know. What is the continuum hypothesis? I don't know anything about math. You know, maybe I'm a sucker, but I feel like I can never actually criticize Nāgārjuna because every time I think of an alternative, it's the next verse. You know?
I have some, well, so I have just that's like kind of a broad criticism, but that I think has solutions that just don't come out in Nāgārjuna, but that one could make, which is just that I feel like a lot of the particular concepts he's deconstructing are just not, I'm not sure how to get to those points always so that they can be deconstructed. Like, for example, the way he frames causality in terms of object causality, like this object being the cause of this object instead of event causality. I understand that that was a way that Abhidharmikas understood causal relations. And therefore, if you're starting from the Abhidharma perspective on that, I can see how you would get there. But I don't think that way about causality. I think about it in terms of events. So unless there's some way for the Madhyamika to make the same arguments about causality being conceptually constructed that work for objects as for events, which I think there are, they're just not in Nāgārjuna because he's not engaging with my worldview. He's engaging with the Abhidharmika's worldview. So there's no obligation on him to be resistant to what, like, you know, my criticism, but I think that there are open, I guess what I would say, open problems, like what Ji-Chen said.
The way I tend to,
for Madhyamika, which is to find ways to make the Madhyamika's project proceed with reference to our present ways of thinking about the world that don't always have a clear way to move from them to the Abhidharmika point of view, such that the standard critiques against the Abhidharmika point of view will work. So I would say that there are definitely a lot of open problems for Madhyamaka in that respect.
It seems like to me though that might be, you think you kind of already pointed to this, that might be asking more out of this project than Nāgārjuna actually intends. Like he's not trying to be exhaustive of all kind of ontological views. He's sort of taking one particular system of view and sort of putting that under analysis. And I feel like maybe this is like an idiosyncratic way of looking at it. So I could be wrong, but sometimes I feel like there's something confusing about calling entire people Madhyamikas, or like Madhyamaka as a sort of overall project. I almost feel like when the Madhyamaka is operating, it is as this sort of immanent dialectical critique that is performed on a system of views that's taken up as the material upon which our Madhyamaka analysis can be deployed. But that doesn't make us Madhyamikas as much as it makes us someone who deploys Madhyamaka analysis. So like, I guess maybe the relationship is like similar to, I guess, like wisdom and skillful means. They come together, but they're not identical. So Nāgārjuna as the Madhyamaka and the Buddhist is not the same thing, but they're not entirely different either, because he's motivated by his Buddhist path to deploy Madhyamaka. And I feel like the way that Madhyamaka is deployed is as these like particular modes of critique of these particular systems. I don't know if I'm making any sense. Like I guess in a general sense, like we can say that we're all Madhyamikas, but we're actually not, except when we're deploying a particular analysis. I don't know if that adds anything to our discussion. We're basically finished with these two chapters. Anyone have any last comments, concerns? Okay, so I think for next week we can keep doing this sort of two chapter thing. So the next one will be 12, an analysis of suffering. That is about 8 pages. Then an analysis of the composite, and that is 10 pages. So 18 pages, I think that's pretty good. Actually, what do you guys think about, well, actually, let's see. At the rate we're going, we have about 8 weeks left. So that's about 2 months. It's not bad. I was wondering, what do you guys think about 3 chapters? So if we also read 14, then that is an extra 7. So 18 plus 7 is what, like 25. Let's try that. And if it ends up being too much, or if we're not able to cover everything the next week, then we can go back to 2 chapters at a time. But at this point, I'm actually finding myself being able to read and follow faster, because we've gone through so many of the same formulaic arguments. That's actually easier to gloss through things now. So, okay, so yeah, so let's do 12, 13, and 14 for next week, same time. Does that sound good for everyone? Cool. Okay, thanks everyone. It was a really nice discussion, even when we sort of went off track. I like these off track things, side conversations we have. It does sometimes always end up wrapping back to what we're talking about, so that's cool. Cool. Okay, well, thank you everyone, and I'll see you next week.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.